Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror in detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling camping and woods horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story: How to Survive Camping the Motherless. I run a private campground. Over a year ago, I started telling you all about my little patch of field and forest and the creatures that live on it, and how to survive them. I did not spare the details, which led to a fair number of you going, "Wow, Kate, you're kind of a monster yourself." I justified it by telling myself that when you're dealing with flesh-eating horses and other monstrosities, you have to be a bit ruthless. Then a year ago, Perkta showed up and gave me a warning that made me reconsider my position. I keep the bloody piece of thread on my dresser as a reminder. If you're new here, you should really start at the beginning, and if you're totally lost, this might help. While today is not her feast day, Bo warned me that the seamstress of slaughter was drawing close. He felt her presence, like a storm on the horizon. I suppose it makes sense that she can show up whenever she feels like it. I don't follow her tenets. I don't weave. My family ancestry is a muddled mess, and we don't keep the traditions of any one culture. Perkta has no traditional claim on me. Her appearance last year was a special interest she showed for reasons, I guess. Perhaps she makes exceptions for people she particularly takes issue with. I suppose it's pointless to wonder why I've been singled out when I'm sure there's much worse people to go after, like insurance company executives. If you're reading this and have the chance to maybe book an executive retreat for said insurance companies, I'll offer a substantial discount for use of my campground. Just saying. But these creatures do what they will. Perhaps I merited special attention because my land was in the early throes of turning ancient, and the decision of who it will go to is of great importance to more than just people that like to go camping. I waited for Perkta's arrival in my living room. My tarot deck was sitting out on the coffee table for no other reason than it felt appropriate. I wasn't trying to do any readings. It hadn't been very effective last year. I feel it was trying to tell me something, but my mind is so preoccupied with the here and now that I don't have space in my brain for these nebulous what-ifs. But honestly, at that moment, my mind was mostly occupied with dread. I can't undo the past. People died on my land this past year, and that cannot be changed. My theory that Perkta was asking for a specific outcome at some point in the future rather than a general, "don't let people die," could very well have been nothing but wishful thinking. There was no avoiding my fate. I could only wait to find out if Perkta took offense at my actions or not. I think I dozed off a bit on the sofa, for I next remember being startled awake by the front door banging open. It brought with it a hefty gust of cold air that sank its teeth into my ears and fingers. I fear January is going to be brutal if the temperature continues to fall like this. Framed in the doorway stood Perkta. She was dressed in a radiant, white gossamer dress with no sleeves. It billowed at her feet like drifts of snow. In one hand she held a needle, already threaded. I eyed it nervously. Granted, it wasn't a plow and chain that she used on particularly wicked individuals, but disemboweling is disemboweling, regardless of how you're sewn back up. Made tea," I offered. She stepped inside, her expression composed and her steps deliberate. Making a point, she did not have to be invited inside. She was an ancient thing and could go as she willed. "That would be lovely," she hissed. So I went to the kitchen where there was already a carafe from earlier in the evening, and when I came back with 2 mugs she was seated on my sofa and was sewing up a rip in one of my jackets. I don't remember quite what caused the tear. It was either while clearing out dead branches or fleeing from the Fomorian. You know, just campground things. I set the tea down in front of her and perched on the edge of a chair, too nervous to actually settle down. "You act like you're ready to flee at any moment," Perkta commented, not taking her eyes off her work. "I am." I laughed nervously. "Did you come to just mend my jacket, or is that thread also meant for me? You tell me. I'm trying. I really am. You don't sound convinced." Her eyes flickered up from her work to regard me. I took a deep breath and tried to summon any conviction I had in my heart. Wasn't I doing better? Wasn't I trying to not take the easy way out, no matter how seductively it whispered to me? Because I'm frightened, I said, my sudden honesty surprising even me. I don't want to die, and yet, that's the only way I read this situation. You said I could save everyone and with the land turning ancient. I think that means I need to let some benevolent creature take my life and entrust the land to its protection. Perkta said nothing. She only continued to sew, and I waited until she was done. She knotted the thread with a few deft motions of the needle and broke the strands with her teeth. Then she set the jacket aside and granted me her full attention. Still, she did not speak. The question of my character was for me alone to answer. I want to do what you told me, I said desperately. Why'd I have to die, though? You should know the power in sacrifice. It's only right, isn't it? After all these generations of sacrificing others to this land, now the debt falls to you. We didn't sacrifice people, didn't you? She leaned forwards and slipped a card out of the tarot deck that sat on the table. Justice. She held it up for me to see, a silent condemnation of my family's blood history. Me and my damn rules. Perhaps they saved some, but they also served to absolve me of responsibility. What's fair is fair, after all. They were warned. I suppose that didn't make it right. Am I, at least, on the right track? This would not be a civil conversation if you were not. I laughed, a brief bout of hysteria induced by how close I'd been sitting to a gory demise and the relief of release. She wasn't here to kill me. I didn't have to save everyone starting with the instant she stabbed her needle through my flesh. At some point in the future, I had to make the right choice, and in the meantime keep the land from falling into the wrong hands. It all sounds so simple, doesn't it? Still, my conversation with Perkta wasn't over. There was something I needed from her. You wouldn't have come here just to inform me I get a reprieve, I said. You'd have just not shown it all. And you wouldn't have invited me for tea if you weren't preparing to ask something of me. I'm not sure what it says about me that the person that truly seems to get me and my nervous habits is someone who runs around replacing people's entrails with straw and rocks. I stood and went to the guest bedroom, which used to be my room when I was a child. I returned with a couple bags of children's shoes and toys. Gifts from the GoFundMe. Y'all are so clever. These are gifts for your children, I said, setting them at her feet. She merely regarded me placidly, her hands crossed over her needle and thread. I have none with me. There are some on this campground and one of a mother. If this past year has taught me anything, it's that the best way to get rid of something inhuman is to stick an even bigger and nastier inhuman thing on it. Perkta was silent and still for a moment. Then she demurely closed her eyes and gestured, beckoning me to come closer. I complied, my heart beating rapidly in my chest. She took my right hand with her left and then held her needle up between us. Then she made a stitch, a careful incision on the tip of my finger, where the skin is calloused and she could run the needle through without drawing blood. It was a strange and unpleasant sensation, having thread drawn through the tip of my finger like that. But it didn't hurt. She put another stitch in my next finger, and so on, until white thread ran loosely between each fingertip of my hand. Then she took the left and did the same, all with the same long, continuous piece of thread. She hummed as she worked and did not open her eyes until it was done. Then she bid me to break the thread myself with my teeth. I stared at my hands and the threads connecting finger to finger, hand to hand. There, she said. All done. Now go bring me my children. I began to walk to the garage, but Perkta stopped me by speaking. You can use the front door, she said slyly. The little girl will respect you as my envoy tonight. An envoy of Perkta. Certainly something that not just anyone can put on their resume. The little girl was standing in the yard, watching as I left through the front door. She wasn't crying. Her eyes were wide and she watched in silence as I walked to the gate. On impulse, I turned to her. I'm not making a mistake, am I? I asked, I didn't expect a response. It's just this year has been so messed up and weird that I didn't want to rule it out, either. The little girl stared back at me for a moment and then slowly, very slowly, shook her head no. I was not making a mistake. Bo told me that the way to avoid the children was to stay off the roads. That meant the way to find them was to stay on the roads. I nervously walked along, wishing I'd thought to grab more than just my jacket. A hat or scarf, maybe. I certainly couldn't wear gloves, and I didn't want to shove my hands in my pockets lest I break the threads. My fingers began to ache, and I was only mostly certain it was from the cold. I wasn't sure what the threads were for or what I was supposed to do with them. I could only hope that, like most of these inhuman things, it would become apparent at the point it was needed. I just entered the deep woods when I saw a figure standing on the road up ahead. I could not see them clearly because a night mist was encroaching on the campground, rolling in and pouring into the low parts of the land. It hovered silver over the snow. I approached warily, gauging the size of the person before me. Small. A child. I took a deep breath and regretted it, for the cold chewed at my lungs. The child was alone. She was small and dirty, standing barefoot in the packed snow on the dirt road. I looked around, trying to make sure her peers weren't lurking in ambush nearby. There were no footprints to betray them. For that matter, she didn't leave any footprints either. "You're looking for us," the child said to me. Her voice seemed wrong. It was too solemn for a child. "I've found a mother for you," I replied, stopping just a few feet away. "My mother wasn't here when I needed her. This one is different. I promise." I held out my hand, the threads glowing like the moonlight. The child looked askance at them, considering. Then, slowly, tentatively, she put her hand in mine. Something flashed through my field of vision. A child. A mother. A frozen lake. "You drowned," I gasped, when the visions cleared. My chest ached, as if I'd been the one thrashing in the darkness and the cold, alone and afraid. I cried for my mother, she whispered, and she never came. The water filled my lungs instead. I told her it was okay. I'd take her to her new mother, and this one would always be there. I squeezed her hand tight. One of the threads loosened from my finger. It wrapped around her wrist. And on we walked, through the woods as the mist steadily grew thicker. The next child was a boy. He died as a teenager. I saw how his mother wasn't ever really there for him, not even as she sat at his hospital bedside as he died after the car crash. I was a little puzzled by this, for he wasn't a child necessarily, and as the thread looped it around his wrist he appeared to me as he did in the moment he died, a teenager with a broken face and blood-stained eyes. But he came with me, as did the next, and the next, and finally, at the last, I understood. A girl. I saw her life. I saw her bury her mother at a younger age than I buried mine. I saw her with children of her own, and I saw them grow up and leave. Then I saw her die, quietly in her sleep. She never woke, only stirred slightly to call out, her lips barely moving, and then she was gone. I was so certain that these were the souls of unbaptized children. But my theories are only theories. Sometimes I'm wrong. Perhaps at one point dying before baptism is all that could give rise to these lost children. But the world has changed. We've changed. And our collective fears and hopes and needs have shifted, moving from the fear of an early death or starvation to the more nebulous fears of loneliness and emptiness. As I watched the old woman crying out softly in her sleep, I finally understood what the children were. The souls of those that died alone, wanting for a mother, and being denied the gentle comfort of a hand to hold in their last moments. I took her hand and promised to take her to someone that would make sure she was never alone again. She gazed up at me with hopeful eyes as a thread wrapped itself around her wrist. The task was done. I collected all the children, and I still had a few strands to spare. Satisfied, I turned to return to the house where Perkta waited for us. It was then that I realized I could no longer see the road. In fact, I couldn't see anything of the campground at all. For a moment I panicked, thinking perhaps I was in the gray world, but there were no trees and no sky, leached of color, just the mist. Sometimes, roads will lead you somewhere other than where you intended to go. There was movement in the fog. I squinted, trying to discern shapes out of the shifting haze. With a start, I realized what it was. Children. Rows and rows of children, all pulling at each other, struggling to get ahead in the surging press of bodies. Their eyes were wide with desperation, a hopeless yearning not out of hunger or malice, but a simple primal need to not be left behind. To not be left alone in this in-between world. There were so many. The tide of bodies vanished into the mist, but I knew they were there, an endless mass of lost souls that all cried out for the same thing. They stretched out fingers in my direction as they pleaded. Mother. I want my mother. And I only had 2 strings left. We're going to play a game, children, I said frantically to the ones I'd already bound. It's called Run Like Hell from the Undead Horde. I ran, and it was like the children and adults yoked to me were nothing more than wisps of wind. They trailed behind me, almost formless, bound only to this reality by the threads around their wrists. I dragged them along in my wake, binding them to my humanity, and carried them out of this half-realm of the lonesome dead. There was a light up ahead, the light of my front porch, the only beacon I had. I ran for it as the horde closed in around me, hands reaching out of the mist to snatch at my jacket. They screamed at me to take them with me, to not leave them alone. But most of all, they cried out for their mothers. I'm sorry, I cried out. There's too many of you. I stretched out my hand for the light of my front porch. Cold hands closed on my legs, seizing the hem of my jeans. The dead sobbed, trying to drag me back in their desperate loneliness. So unwilling to be left alone in their moment of need once again that they were willing to consign another to the same fate. I felt my fingers touch a doorknob, and then I was falling forwards, tumbling into the warmth and light of my entryway. Panting, I whirled around. The children were gone. The mist was gone. There was only my front yard and the little girl, watching, just as she'd been when I'd left. I slowly closed the door, staring at the threads still attached to my fingers. Did I fail? I asked, not turning around, fearing the answer. Did I not run fast enough? The children I'd had with me were nowhere to be seen. No. Come here. She snipped the threads from my fingers, one by one, and tucked them away into some invisible pocket. As she worked, I noticed that the toys and shoes were gone. I also noticed that her shears were stained with layers of blood, but I tried not to focus on that too much. Thank you for collecting them for me, she said. If more find your way to the campground, I'll come for them as well. There were countless souls. Are they all trapped there until someone claims them? She tilted her head at me as if I'd asked a strange question. Not all are trapped, she said. Nor are all of them souls. Some are echoes. You shouldn't bother with such things. It is beyond your domain. Life advice from Perkta. Don't worry about the dead, for there's nothing we can do for them. It's cold comfort. I half listened as Perkta told me that she'd take the children with her, and she'd set them loose on the night of her wild hunt. I wondered if the children would ride a wagon, in amongst the hordes of her followers, screeching as they raced through the night and chased down anything unfortunate enough to be caught in their path. Then she said something that brought my full attention back to her. You belong with my hunt, Perkta said thoughtfully. Granted, you're currently alive, but your death is written in your family's blood. What's a handful of years matter? 1? 10? Come with me, Kate, and I'll give you the mother you still yearn for. I looked up at her. Her appearance had changed. She wore boots. Her gossamer dress was gone, replaced by practical jeans and a flannel plaid shirt I knew too well. I knew what it smelled like. It was my mother's favorite, and Perkta wore my mother's face. Her hair, the steely look in her eyes, glinting like fire. You cry out for you, do you not? She continued. I hear it in your heart. Everyone dies, I said through clenched teeth. I stepped backwards towards the door. I will learn to live with this. You don't have to. She reached out for me with my mother's hand. I watched her die, all those years ago. In my dream, far away in my bed in my college apartment. It was a true dream. The little girl sat on her bed, her hands stained with my mother's blood, and her abdomen was split open and the organs inside strewn about and packed back in carelessly, like a child assembling bricks. Now Perkta stood here, hand outstretched, coming to claim me as one of her own lost children, to run in her wild hunt, to be lost forever to this world and belong to the other. I think. I went a little mad at that point. I ran, straight out the front door, heedless of the little girl or my own safety. I stumbled down the front steps and the little girl hurried forwards, but it wasn't for me. She stepped behind me, standing between me and Perkta, and I didn't dare stop and watch. I could barely see, anyway, for the tears in my eyes. I burst through the gate and out to the road, and I ran to the only place I could think of. I ran to the graveyard. I collapsed in front of my mother's grave, and I screamed my grief to the cold earth, weeping for a mother that was gone and could not be replaced. I was there for a long time. Finally, a voice made me come back to myself. The little girl. I didn't turn around. She wasn't close by. She'd never crossed into the graveyard before, to my knowledge. She's gone, the little girl said. I don't think she'll be back until next year. She didn't try to take you? I sniffled. I have no mother, for I was never born. She's not a ghost. She was never a human to begin with. She's something fully inhuman, created specifically as my family's curse. For a moment, I was stunned at this revelation, and my mind whirled with all the questions it created. How does such a thing happen? What is my family's relationship with this land? I asked where she came from then, if not a mother. The little girl didn't answer. I twisted where I knelt and turned around to look. Above me loomed the beast, and in its jaws was the little girl's body, slack and silent. Its teeth were like spikes carved from obsidian, its multitude of eyes shone like stars, and it consumed the sky above me so that all I could see was its hide, carved from the waning night itself. I could feel the heat of its throat and the weight of its breath upon me. My death, staring down upon me, mere feet away. It was like the world spun. I felt like a feather, buffeted by a storm, my body weightless, and then knew nothing more. I awoke to find myself alone in the graveyard. The sun was over the horizon, and embarrassingly, my jeans were wet. If I have to surmise what happened, I pissed myself and fainted. So, yeah, that's a thing that happened. Look, I'm a campground manager. I've dealt with a lot of shit over the years, but I fear the beast like I fear no other. At least it was sated by the little girl. At least I'm still here. This world is a cruel place. It takes our fears and turns them against us. These things that we dread, that we try not to think about but haunt us nonetheless, in the silent spaces of our mind, are plucked clear and given form and life. They are turned into weapons, into monsters, and into curses. This world shackles us with the things we seek to flee. I have no comfort to give you. How can I tell you to come to terms with your loneliness, with your loss, when I can't do so myself? Perkta was right. I miss my mother. I miss both my parents. I want them back more than anything. And I fear death because I know it will be by the hand of some inhuman thing, and by that nature, I will be alone when I die. Second story. Central Michigan camping horror. I have always loved camping. There is something about being out in a tent away from electronics and everyday life that gives me a sort of reminder that I'm not totally dependent on civilization and phones to survive. I know that not bringing my phone is where I made my biggest mistake, but hey, it's Michigan. We don't have scary predators here that cause me to worry, and I knew these particular woods very well. Never experienced anything bad before, so I figured it was as safe of a place to be. It was my younger brother Todd, my sister Amy, and her husband Don, and me. All of us agreed no phones, just tents, beer, and a relaxing time away from life. Well, I thought it was going to be relaxing. You can choose to believe what you will, but this did happen, and my life is never going to be the same. We all rode together in my sister's van and parked at the site we used to party at as teenagers. Even camped here a few times, but had about 5 more people with us. Ugh. The spider spot, really? Amy complained. When we first found this spot years before, there was an old stump that was littered with wolf spiders. We burned it to the ground after waking up to big nasty spiders all over us after a night of drinking. So we named it the spider spot. Come on, that stump's gone. Besides, it's only a quarter-mile walk and my feet have been killing me from work. Todd sighed. We all grabbed our shit and started walking the 10 to 15-minute walk, looking forward to the fire and, of course, beer. The worst part of the walk was the damn broken branches that seemed to jump out just to stab your face and break off. After we finally got there, we did the usual setting tents up and grabbed firewood so the rest of the night would be filled with beer, laughter, then bed after about 25 creepy nighttime pissing trips. It must have been around 1:30 a.m. when things started getting weird. Hey, did you guys hear that? Don asked, shushing everyone. We sat quietly and after a few seconds heard the unmistakable sound of laughter. Just some other campers, man, probably doing the same thing we are. I answered with a laugh. Without warning, Todd shouted loudly to the people, "Got any more beer?" We all laughed and shushed him. We were having a blast and didn't think anything of it. Then we heard running. "What the hell, Todd, you pissed them off?" Amy started to panic a little. "Don't worry, Amy. They are probably drunk, just wanting to talk." Don comforted her, but you could see the worried look on his face as the footsteps got closer. My heart was beating out of my chest, thinking we were going to get into a drunken brawl. "Got any more beer?" It sounded like a weird recording of Todd, only different. What the fuck? All of the hair on my arms stood on end. It really creeped me out. "Very funny assholes," Todd shouted. Then more running footsteps, only this time away from our campsite. Must be drunk teenagers messing with us. Amy breathed a sigh of relief. We all kind of nodded and agreed it was time for bed. That was kind of a buzzkill and I think creeped us out a little. "Hey, I'm sleeping in your tent, bud," Todd said, kind of with a nervous glance around the darkness. "Pussy," I said with a laugh, but was secretly happy not to have to rough it out alone. Once we all were in our tents, it was very quiet. It was the only time I can remember being kind of scared. I must have dozed off because I woke up to Todd shaking me. "Dude, listen," he whispered quietly. At first there was nothing. Then I heard the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. It sounded right outside my tent, like a foot away. "I'm sleeping in your tent tonight, bud." Again, it sounded like Todd, only not like him. I was about to shit my pants. Todd looked at me in horror, and I must have had the same look on my face because I was petrified. Then we heard the running again, and whatever it was, it ran off again. "Let's hurry, get the fuck out of here," Don shouted to my surprise. They must have been listening to whatever it was too. We all jumped out of our tents and ran back to the van as quick as possible. I've never felt more relieved to be out of the woods. This was all last weekend and is 100% true. The worst part is Todd called me and said he's been hearing something outside his house at night. He wants me to come over tonight, but I'm honestly afraid too. Third story. The reason why we don't go camping anymore. With the weather becoming warm again and our local parks opening, I now have to think of good reasons to turn down invitations to go camping from friends and family. While I was still a teenager, I went as often as I could. Any weekend I was free, I was in the woods relaxing. Sometimes I brought friends, sometimes I went by myself. After finishing school, my life had become fairly hectic. I still did my best to take a few camping trips during the year. I'm glad I was so stubborn on the idea of going out inside the woods when the chance arose, because I had met my husband on a camping trip. The story of how we met is a bit long and embarrassing on my part. I had gone out for a quick washroom break in the middle of the night. An owl or some sort of other screeching night creature startled me, and I took off running back to where I had thought my tent was. In the darkness of the moonless night, I caught a tree root and broke my ankle. I was unable to move until morning. I was in so much pain and embarrassment, I accepted my death, ready to be a nice meal for the wildlife. I was rescued by Nicholas. Even back then, he was a large, intimidating-looking man. Full beard, axe in hand, he looked about ready to chop me into pieces. My husband-to-be was cursed with looking the complete opposite of his nature. He carried me out of the woods and came to the hospital with me because none of my family members were available on such short notice. We have barely been apart since the day and married the moment it was legal. We met in the woods, so camping held a special meaning for us. Every trip was almost like a honeymoon. Although we thought we clearly looked like a loving couple on our trips, most people we met didn't clue into that fact. They all assumed we were just two good friends drinking beer and finishing. It was a game of ours to play it cool and see how long it would take people to start questioning things. Near the end of the summer, we reserved one spot in a popular local area. The camping areas were spread out far enough for some sort of privacy, but a family we often camped close by and met at the lake for fishing still had no idea about us after 4 years of seeing each other. They saw our wedding rings and commented how nice it was for two good friends to be away from our wives for a long weekend. Being in the woods holds such good memories for me, but it only takes one night to ruin everything. After what happened last summer, I've refused to ever be in the forest again. The last time we went, it was a very normal experience. Because we were veterans at that point, setting up our campsite took an hour at most. Before anyone else had really arrived and finished setting up, Nicholas was gathering firewood, and I had started to walk down to the lake. If I was lucky enough, I could catch something for our lunch. But we always brought something for a backup just in case nothing was biting. Sitting on the edge of the calm lake, I started to bait my hook and set up my fishing rod. It was still a little cool from the early morning. By the afternoon, I was certain it would warm up. I feared for a summer storms rolling in because the radio on the way down warned of thunderstorms over the weekend. But that morning the weather was perfect. I got comfortable and threw out an almost perfect cast. I was waiting for Nicholas to come and join me when I saw a blur of white through the trees on the other side of the lake. I had to squint, but I could have sworn I saw a person walking through the trees getting closer to the lake's edge. When the figure stopped at the edge of the water, I lifted my hand to give them a friendly wave. I thought it was a woman. I couldn't see any features besides a white dress and long hair flowing in the breeze. She must have seen me from across the lake because she raised her arm and waved back. "Who are you waving at?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. Nicholas was pretty silent for a man his size. Without me hearing him, he had come up behind me. "A woman over there. She must be out for a walk because there aren't any campsites on the other side of the lake. I don't see her." I raised my eyebrow, confused at him. I had only turned away for a second. I didn't think she could go back into the woods so fast. But when I looked back, she was gone. The lake rippled slightly from the breeze. I didn't even hear the normal bird song or see any of the friendly waterfowl that made the lake their home. I didn't think I imagined her or got confused by a reflection off the lake. But it wasn't really that big of a deal. I dropped the matter and helped set up a spot for Nicholas. While he had been collecting firewood, he had run into one of the regulars we often saw at the park camping. We often shared anything we fished up with them. Due to a medical emergency, they had to leave the campgrounds. Their son had gotten very sick, and they weren't going to risk him sleeping it off. They had grabbed their important items in a hurry. They knew that myself and Nicholas would be close by and came over asking for a favor. They trusted us to break down their campsite and pleaded for us to watch over their bigger items. If they didn't come back for them at the end of the weekend, we could leave their things at the ranger's office. Nicholas agreed. I hoped their son would be all right. He may have got away from his parents and eaten a berry he shouldn't have. We would gladly watch over their things. It would be the first year at this site without someone being close by. The rest of the day went by completely normal. We broke down our camping neighbor's site and cooked up the 2 fish I had caught. A bit on the small size, but they would do. The only strange thing I noticed during the day was how silent the woods was. I barely heard any birds, and they sounded very far away when they did chirp. We both turned in shortly after the sun had set. We had plans to go on a long hike the next day. Being well rested would be a good idea. I was getting older and wondering how much longer I could sleep on the hard ground for. Being wrapped in big, comfortable arms did help. I don't know how it started, but we made a game for nights we couldn't fall asleep. One of us would start with an animal with a weapon, then the next person would say another animal with a different weapon that could beat the first in a fight. It would quickly get into ridiculous territory, like a shark riding an army of crabs as its weapon. Whoever laughs first loses. We spent many nights snuggled close and giggling like teen girls on a sleepover. A falcon with a fencing sword. Nicholas started off. I raise you a parrot with double daggers. Those wavy ones. Shoot, that's a good one. An ostrich. No weapon. It's just really mean. I felt a giggle start bubbling up, and I forced it down. I paused to think of something not ready to back out of our game. But a noise outside our tent made me stop. I sat up slightly, trying to hear better. I could have sworn I heard a scream. I had been out in the woods often enough to know what the wildlife sounded like. This was for certain a human scream. It sounded off in the distance. The trees muted sounds, so I wondered just how close the person was. I heard it again. A long wailing screech that made my stomach drop. Did you dash? I started to speak, but Nicholas grabbed me and forced me back down. He held me tightly, and it was somewhat out of character for him. The suddenness and his mood shift frightened me more than the faint screaming outside. Nick Dash, I said, but was quickly shushed by him. I looked up at him in the darkness, trying to make out his expression. I could feel his hand shaking slightly against me, and I couldn't remember ever seeing him scared. He was the big, tough, brave husband. The one who answered phone calls and ushered spiders out of the house. He was scary and strong and could chop firewood in one swung, and yet he was holding on to my small frame as if I was some sort of protective ward against whatever was outside. My heart was beating so fast I nearly didn't hear what had scared him so badly. I heard a crunching of footsteps outside. Someone was wandering around our campsite. I suddenly knew why Nicholas shushed me. The only weapon we had was the axe for firewood. The axe that I was pretty sure had been left outside our tent. We also had bear mace, but it was pretty old. And if the wind blew the wrong way, the bear mace would just be a setback. I held my husband as I tried to listen for more footsteps, praying. I was just hearing things. Our food had been put up. We knew how to keep animals away. The soft crunching of dirt didn't sound like a large creature walking around. But I heard breathing. Heaving breathing that did sound like it belonged to a bear. My mind started to race. I wondered if some crazy person who lived in the woods year-round came across our campsite and just wanted to steal food. I didn't know what to do in that moment. I wanted them to just leave. My big, scary-looking husband may be able to frighten them away, but if they had a gun, we couldn't do anything about it. And then there was that screaming. I could still hear it between the soft footsteps and heavy breathing coming from outside. Go away. Go away. Go away. In that moment, I was so frozen in fear I couldn't do much else but repeat that mantra, hoping my mental prayer would be enough to force the unwanted guests away. Nicholas had been doing much more thinking than myself. He had wrapped his arms around me and buried me so close to him if someone opened the tent it would look like he was alone. If someone attacked, they would go for him first, unaware of the smaller second person in the tent. It would give me the chance to attack back or by some miracle get away. We couldn't go outside. It was clear by the footsteps there was more than one person. The best plan we had was to be quiet and hope the people left. If they took our supplies, we didn't mind paying for new ones. I was still scared out of my mind when I heard a new noise. My lungs felt like they would burst from fear when I heard the tent zipper start to move. So slowly, I watched it out of the corner of my eye as it started to open from the top. I couldn't see outside even when it was halfway open. I felt Nicholas tense up. He may jump up and defend us at any second. I didn't want that. I didn't want him to be hurt. I just wanted whoever was out there to go away. The zipper stopped halfway. I hoped it would remain like that. I still heard the breathing of the person outside. To my horror, I saw something come into our tent. A clawed hand. The claws were curled and the size of my fingers. Even in my fear, I thought it was a joke. Some sort of costume prop. No animal I knew of had hands so human-like. And no human had claws. I wondered if some other camper decided to pull a prank on us. A single claw reached down and started to force the zipper open more. This had to be a joke. It had to be. A smell came in with a small breeze. It was a little musty and somewhat similar to wet fur. I didn't know what we would do once the zipper was fully open and we could see what was outside. But thank God we never need to find out. I heard a scream. It was so loud it sounded like it came directly behind our tent. I jumped and muffled my own scream into Nicholas' chest. The scream kept going. A long wail of true and utter fear. Whoever was outside either was startled by the scream or decided to follow it. The screaming sound started to move away from our tent, and the footsteps and heavy breathing followed. I don't know how long we stayed just holding each other listening. It felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes. I let out a small noise when my husband shot up and bolted outside. He came back a few seconds later holding our firewood axe. Both of us sat, facing the now closed tent flap axe at the ready. And we sat like that the entire night. I was so wired I was wide awake when the light became gray outside our tent. During the rest of the night, I heard no one back in our camp, but I still heard that horrible scream from time to time in the distance. Our plan was to pack up as fast as we could and leave the equipment we had been guarding at the ranger station. Aside from odd tracks all over our campsite, nothing had been disturbed and touched. They looked almost human, but with what looked like claw marks dragging in the dirt. "Hey folks, early morning?" We both jumped at the voice. I let out a small scream I wasn't proud of, but when we spun around, we saw a forest ranger. I knew his face from years of coming here, but not his name. He noticed our fear and held out a hand trying to calm us. "Are you two all right? Did you see a bear or something?" he asked. "Or something," Nicholas confirmed. The next few minutes was us telling the ranger what had happened last night. I was still shaking, so Nicholas took over speaking. But what confused me was he didn't mention the screaming that scared off our unwanted quests. That sounds strange, all right. Maybe some kids playing a prank, the ranger said with a shrug. There was screaming. I stuttered and both men looked at me. I heard screaming all night. Well, you always had better hearing than me. Maybe someone was off in the woods trying to scare us, Nicholas said slowly with a nod. It worked. I grumbled. All right, we'll look into this. Prank or not, this isn't acceptable. Aside from that, I came down here to tell you folks there is a storm blowing in soon. It's up to you if you want to stay, but I would advise against it. It's going to be a really bad one, and the last time we had a storm this bad, people got blown away with their tents. If you want to pack up, we'll refund you for the last 2 days you paid for. We were going to leave either way. The storm just gave us a good excuse. The ranger was kind enough to help us carry the extra gear after we told him it belonged to the campers who left the other day. He would walk with us back to the ranger station. We didn't want a refund for our last 2 days we wouldn't be camping for. It would be a donation to help the park pay for whatever was needed. Our campsite empty, all 3 of us was ready to go. And it was a good thing we left when we did. If we stayed, we would have died or gotten very hurt. We had only been a few feet away from the site when a massive crack and horrible sound came behind us. I had just calmed down a little, but the thundering sound made me cry out again and jumped nearly 10 feet in the air. All of us turned trying to figure out what had made such a sound. Where our empty campsite had been was now covered with a dead tree that had just fallen over. It crashed right on top of where our tent would have been. I was certain if we stayed, that tree would have killed us. All 3 stood in shock, staring at the fallen tree. I started to walk up to it for a reason I didn't know. I just felt like I had to get a better look. Our campsite had been ruined, littered with fallen branches. Nicholas had come up and took my arm to gently take me back onto the path. We didn't know if the tree had knocked against another, making it more likely to fall as well. That area was dangerous. I let myself be guided back, but I saw the base of the fallen tree. From the freshly upturned roots, I thought I saw something tangled in the brown roots. Something white and straight sticking out of the ground. Something that looked like a human femur. We got to the ranger's station and made a more official report of our night. The sky had already darkened, the storm coming in faster than expected. Other rangers had gone off to warn people, and the parking lot was slowly emptying out of cars of campers who wisely decided to leave. I called the ranger office a week after asking about if they ever found out who had tried scaring us away. The ranger who picked up the phone was the one we dealt with, so he was glad to talk with me. They hadn't found out anything. The park emptying made it hard, and the storm washed away anything useful. He also wanted to tell me something. He didn't know if he was legally allowed to yet, but he didn't want me to find out later and get freaked out. The tree that had fallen over did in fact have human remains tangled into the roots. They found one intact femur and some broken bones looking like ribs. When they started looking, they found more bones buried and scattered around. They assumed the body had been there for years, and they hadn't found enough to determine who they were or how they died. Also tangled in with the roots was some fabric that looked like it had been a white dress or skirt at one point. For those past few years, we had camped right next to a human body without ever knowing. If that tree hadn't fallen over, I doubted they would ever been found. I didn't tell Nicholas what I had found out. I think he doesn't want to upset me by talking about the trip. He didn't seem very bothered over what happened, but knows it stressed me out. I had nightmares for months. I try and keep an eye on seeing if there are any updates on the case, but accepted the fact they most likely won't ever know who died or who had been buried beneath that tree. For how many people go missing in the woods, I think camping near a death site is pretty common. More common than what most people would think. I'm thankful we got out of those woods alive. I'm a bit of a city person now and would like to keep it that way. Fourth story. Our ancestors were right to fear the forest. I read once that in antiquity, people were advised to avoid the forest and wilds. These territories were treacherous and often unexplored or unmarked. Those who would enter would not always return, and so myths began to spread that terrible things lurked within these lands. Most people were content with letting the untamed lands remain so. As time went on, though, most of the world moved on to fearing other things. I, however, have come to fear the woods much like our ancestors did. My family moved to the small wooded town of Sunderland, Vermont, when I was 8. My parents wanted someplace quiet and not so crowded, something in contrast to a place like Boston. I didn't particularly want to move, but I hated Boston anyways, so I didn't argue. The place my parents bought was a rustic 2-story with a backyard that rested against the western edge of a forest. For the first 7 years I lived in Sunderland, things were normal. The woods and I had a healthy relationship. I'd hang out within viewing range of the house, and I would never go in after dark. That changed when I was a junior in high school. That's when my nightmare began. It was a late summer afternoon, and the sky was a dull gray. My friend Chris and I went into the woods behind my house to smoke a joint he bought off a kid in our calculus class for $30. It was a fatty, but Chris definitely got ripped off. "We don't need to go far. I just don't want my parents to be able to see us," I told Chris. "You've never explored deeper than this?" he asked. "A couple times with my mom and dad, but I've never really been interested otherwise." "Then it's time for you to go on an adventure," he said, "and I've got the perfect solution to your fear of getting lost." Chris stopped and dropped his backpack at his feet. He rummaged around for a moment and pulled out a can of red spray paint. "We can make a ring on the trees we pass so we don't get lost." "Why are you even carrying that around?" I asked. "Never know when you might want to mark your territory." "You're an idiot, dude," I laughed. We continued walking deeper into the forest, Chris marking the way. I let him walk ahead of me as we walked further on ground made soft by years of decay. After a few minutes, he slowed down abruptly before hurrying over to something and saying, "Hey Heather, come take a look at this." "What's up?" I asked as I approached his side. "Check this hole out." Just a few feet in front of Chris was a pit. It was probably 3 to 4 meters in diameter. It looked like someone had used a giant post-hole digger to lift a perfect cylinder out of the forest floor. Rope-like vines hung around the edges, but the walls of the hole were strangely smooth. How deep do you think it is? I heard Chris light the joint. Good enough spot, he mumbled to himself. No idea. Let's throw some stuff in it. I kicked a rock in and waited to hear it collide with something, but there was only silence. Chris threw in a couple branches as I stood close to the edge, watching them fall into the black. Silence again. Freaky, Chris exhaled smoke and passed me the joint. Thanks, I said as I took a deep hit and peered into the pit. It was almost mesmerizing. Though the longer I stared, the more nervous I felt. I felt as if something beyond the darkness was staring back at me. I took another hit and passed the joint. I don't like this hole, I said. My head hurts looking into it. We continued to hand the joint back and forth as we stared into the pit. What do you think's down there? Chris asked. Probably dirt and lots of bugs. I hate bugs. Chris kicked a bunch of dirt into the hole. I dunno. They can be kinda cool, except spiders. Yeah, fuck spiders. Also, fuck this pit. Let's go home, Chris said as he tossed the still smoking roach into the pit. We watched the light get swallowed by the darkness that filled the hole. Man, that's deep, I whispered before I turned to follow Chris, who was walking back. As we made our way to my house, I felt like I had seen or done something I wasn't meant to. I revisited the site in my nightmares that evening. In my dream, I was staring up at myself and Chris from within the pit. When Chris tossed the roach into the pit, I watched it fall in slow motion for what seemed like an eternity. When the ember tip finally went out, there was an inhuman cry that carved into my eardrums like a hot awl. My vision cannonballed out of the pit and swerved through the trees in the forest until it stopped just outside my bedroom window, where I saw myself sleeping. I immediately woke up and looked out of my bedroom window, my eyes searching wildly for something new or out of place. But there was nothing there. I sat there hyperventilating for several seconds before I started to calm down. The next day at school, I hurried over to Chris during our shared free period in the back of the library. Hey man, how's it going? He didn't respond. Yo, you good? I put my hand on his shoulder and he jolted upright. Shit, you scared the fuck out of me, he said sleepily, rubbing his eyes. Sorry, I was taking a nap. I didn't get much sleep last night. Did he have the same dream? I thought to myself. I didn't ask. I just wanted it to be a weird nightmare. I sat down across from him at the table and pulled my laptop out. So, what's good? I asked. Not much, but listen to this. After I went home last night, I couldn't stop thinking about the hole. It was weird, right? Chris answered. Yeah, very, I replied. So, I decided to do some Googling about really deep pits and came across this thing called Mel's Hole. Some guy called this paranormal radio show in the 90s and talked about this hole he found that was so deep that even an 80,000-foot fishing line didn't reach the bottom. The thing might be a hoax, but regardless, it got me thinking. How does the hole like the one we found exist? No idea, but there's something not right about it. And on a side note, can we stop calling it the hole? It's kind of bothering me referring to it like that. How about Heather's Hole? It's in your backyard, after all. Fuck you. That's gross. I laughed. Something else. How about the circle? It was a perfect circle, after all. That's better. So, should we go back and check it out later? Chris asked. Was he not afraid of that thing like I was? I dunno, Chris. The circle makes me really anxious. So what are we supposed to do? Forget about it. Chris said with a hint of frustration. I don't know what I want to do. But Chris cut me off. You had a dream, too, didn't you? I stared into his eyes. They twitched. Why, yeah. The falling roach and then something coming out of the circle, right? Yeah, I saw it too. I sat in silence for a moment. You want to go back after that? We had the same dream, man. That means something. Nothing's happened. For all we know, we were just scared by it and had really similar dreams. Chris had a point. But what if something does happen? Chris scratched his cheek. We'll go from there. Fine, I muttered. Anyways, did you do the homework for Miss Kennedy's class? After school, I had a lot of homework that day and wasn't feeling very social, so I decided to just stay in for the night. While I was working on a short story for my American storytelling class, I heard my parents get in from work. I continued typing away when I heard footsteps ascending the staircase. They stopped just outside my bedroom door. "What's up?" I shouted. Silence. "Mom." I waited for a response. "Dad?" Again, silence. Chills slid down my spine as I remembered the dream from the night before. I sat frozen to my chair until a heavy knock on the door made me jump in my seat. I stared at the door for what felt like hours, paralyzed by fear. After a few minutes, I heard the front door open again, this time accompanied by the voices of my parents. I breathed a sigh of relief. I'm just imagining things, I told myself. I opened my bedroom door so I felt safer, knowing now that my parents were home. With a slight tremble, I resumed writing my short story. Later that night as I drifted off, the same dream I had had the night before played back to me. Once again, I woke up after seeing myself asleep in my bed, this time shivering and covered in sweat. I jumped out of bed and pulled my blinds shut. I looked at my alarm clock. 3:02 a.m. Suddenly, I heard slow, methodical footsteps ascending the staircase again. Moving quickly, I shoved the mini fridge in my room in front of the bedroom door and got back in bed, cowering underneath my covers as I stared at the doorknob. It slowly began to turn. "Go away, go away, go away, go away," I pleaded under my breath. There was the sound of something running at the door and then bang, 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 bang. The door shook one last time. Then, silence. I stared at the door until I drifted back into uneasy sleep. The next morning, I was awoken by more heavy banging at my door. I jolted upright. "Heather, open this door," shouted my mom. I sighed in relief as I got out of my bed and moved the fridge away from the door. My mom instantly opened it. "Why was your door blocked?" I debated telling her the truth, but knew she wouldn't believe me. I was moving my furniture around last night and forgot to move the fridge back. "Sorry." My mom looked at me with exasperation. "Okay, but don't leave it front of your door. What if there was a fire?" "Sorry, Mom." "Come downstairs for breakfast," Dad made waffles. When I got to school, I immediately met with Chris. I think something followed us from the circle. "What are you talking about?" Chris replied. "So nothing happened to you last night?" "No. Why?" "Something tried to get into my room." "How do you know?" "Just trust me, Chris." "Fuck. I'm serious about this." "Calm down. Just tell me what happened." I told Chris everything I'd experienced the previous night. "Christ. Do you think it'll happen again tonight?" "I don't know. Probably. We have to do something. We don't even know what this thing is or what it wants. What can we do? Maybe there's some kind of offering we can make. I think the fire from the joint woke it up, so there must be something we can do to maybe calm it down." "I don't know. That's what they do in horror movies. This is real life, though." "Well, do you have a better idea?" "No, I guess not. We should try throwing some meat and jewelry into the hole after school." "That's oddly specific. What else do demons want?" "Flowers and mixtapes." I replied sarcastically. "All right, fine. We'll go with meat and jewelry. I'll bring what I can to your house around 5. "Sounds good." That afternoon, I watched as Chris walked up my driveway. "You ready?" I asked him. "Yeah. Are you?" "You don't look so good." Chris replied. "I don't really want to go back there, but I'd rather fix whatever is happening." The two of us followed the marked trees to the circle. "You," Chris exclaimed, holding his nose. "Smells like rotten eggs." "Did it smell like this last time?" I asked. I couldn't remember. Definitely not. I peered over the edge and felt an urge to jump. I stepped back. "All right, let's throw in our offerings." Chris threw some leftover meat he'd had in his fridge into the hole, and I threw in jewelry I didn't wear anymore. Some gold, some silver. Nothing happened. Is that it? Chris asked. We won't know until tomorrow. I felt a sense of relief, as though a heavy weight had lifted from my shoulders. We went back to my place and played video games until Chris had to go home. I felt uneasy but hopeful as the night came. I hadn't heard anything out of place so far. When I went to bed, I laid there listening to the dark silence, fearing that it would not last. To my surprise, it did. I finally fell asleep and didn't wake up again until morning. The offering must have worked. When I got to school, I approached Chris during our shared period. Hey man, I think we did it, I exclaimed. I don't know about that, Chris replied absently. My gut sank. What do you mean? Once I got home last night, my whole house smelled like rotten eggs. I spent like an hour trying to find the source of the smell, but eventually I couldn't even smell it anymore. So I just went to my room and went on Reddit. As I was falling asleep, I heard glass shatter downstairs. I figured it was probably just my cat knocking over a glass or something. But when I got down there, the glass from the front door was broken all over on the living room floor. I couldn't see anyone outside, but I got this awful feeling that I should not go out there. Where were your parents? Date night? They didn't get back until after all this. Well, what happened next? Well, I didn't go outside. I called my parents and told them that someone threw a rock through the front door, and they said they'd deal with it when they got home. I just went in my room and looked at eye bleach and shied videos to try to calm myself, but I just couldn't shake the dread. Then there were these heavy footsteps running down the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart was fucking racing. They'd reach the end of the hall, then run the opposite direction, until finally something heavy slammed into my door. I was freaking out at this point, especially when I realized I'd left my cell phone downstairs. Why didn't you call the cops when your door shattered? I don't know. I don't always think straight when I'm afraid. All right. Sorry. Just tell me the rest. Chris sighed. Anyways, I heard footsteps above me in the attic, too. Then something started tapping on my window, but I was too afraid to open the curtains. Eventually, I heard my parents' car coming up the driveway, and all the sounds suddenly stopped. It took me a few minutes to calm myself down, but I told my parents that I thought someone had broken in and might be hiding in the house. They called the cops, who came by and did a search. Did they find anything? No, but they said they'll station a car outside for a couple nights just to make sure no one comes back. Well, what should we do? Chris was silent for a minute. What if it wants something living? No, Chris, I won't do that, I said sternly. Do what? A sacrifice? Are you serious? Well, your fucking jewels and meat didn't do anything. Chris was getting agitated. I understood his fear, but I didn't want to do something violent to appease this thing. Listen, man, I want to stop this as much as you do, but not like this. It doesn't have to be a dog or goat or something. We could just trap a squirrel or rabbit or something and throw it in. I sighed. If you trap them, then fine. Thank you. We'll make this stop. I really hope so, I said. On another note, did you do Ms. Chambers' essay? Aw, fuck. That night I dreamed again, but the nightmare had changed. I was dangling in the pit, clutching a vine. I was filled with dread as I peered into the darkness below. I tried to climb out, but the vine broke. As I fell deep into the abyss, windows started appearing in the dirt and stone that surrounded me. I could see my family, Chris, and windows that showed families and children in vintage clothing. The farther I fell, the more disturbing the images through the windows became. My eyes flooded with tears. I started to see people I knew from school silently weeping blood. I saw my parents lying motionless in the backyard. I saw Chris crying in his bed, his teeth stained with blood. My descent slowed until I landed in a bed, my own bed, with my bedroom forming from out of the darkness. There was a steady tapping at my window, and I slowly got out of bed despite my overwhelming anxiety. I felt like I was walking through water as I moved through my room. As I approached the window, I could see the outline of Chris standing in my yard. My window unlocked itself and gently opened, a cool breeze rolling through. "Chris," I shouted. He began to laugh, the sound of a crowd of people, not one boy. He sank into the ground as the world around me began to shake. I woke up to find my bed shaking violently. I started screaming, and it suddenly stopped. My heart was racing, and I barely had time to catch my breath before I heard a light tapping on my window. I tried to ignore it, but the longer I did so, the heavier it became until I heard the glass crack. Then silence. I was not about to look out my window. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Chris's number. He picked up almost immediately. "Are you okay?" "What's up?" Chris said. "More stuff happened. We need to finish this tomorrow." "Did the traps catch anything?" I said between heavy breaths. "I haven't checked yet." "What happened?" I woke up from a nightmare to my bed shaking and something hitting my window. "Were you awake when I called?" "Yeah, some stuff happened here too." I went downstairs to get a glass of water, and all the windows and doors in the entire house were wide open. I tried to wake my parents up, but they're out really cold. "What about the cops? Wasn't there one stationed outside?" "They were asleep, too. The cops really are useless." "Is everything else okay?" "I've been hearing footsteps throughout the house. I've just been hiding in my room. I'll go to bed when the sun is up again." "I don't blame you. Just be safe. Will you stay on the phone with me?" "Yeah, sure. I can't sleep anyways." I stayed on the phone with Chris until sunlight poured through my windows. I could hear what sounded like distant whispers outside my window throughout the night, but they disappeared with the dark. The rest of the day went normally, and the two of us met up after school in my backyard. My parents were still at work as I waited outside my house smoking a bowl. After a couple minutes, Chris came around the corner holding two humane traps. One had a large rabbit in it, the other a restless raccoon. My heart sank thinking of what was going to happen to these innocent forest creatures. "Are you ready to end this?" Chris said to me. "More ready than you can imagine." I feel bad about the animals, though. Chris looked at the animals and frowned. "I'm not excited either, but it's the only thing that makes sense anymore. Come on, let's get to it." The two of us walked through the forest, following the marked trees to the circle. The land around us was silent. In the cages, the animals were going berserk, biting at the cage and making horrible sounds. I felt both emotional anguish and physical dread. As we approached the circle, Chris turned to me. "Does it look bigger than before to you?" I looked at it. I wasn't sure, but it definitely seemed larger. "Yeah, it kinda does look bigger." "All right, do you want to throw them in?" Chris asked me, lifting up the cages. "I really don't. I'll cry if I do it." "Fuck. Okay, I'll do it." Chris walked over to the edge of the circle and peered inside, taking a deep breath. "Okay." I watched as Chris threw the panicking animals into the abyss, the sounds of their whimpers and cries going silent as the circle swallowed them. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I wiped my face with the back of my sleeve. "Is that it? Can we go now? Let's hope this works." "Yeah. Let's go back and smoke a bowl. I need to relax right now." As night fell, we parted ways. The events of the last few days, ever since we had stumbled across the circle, had been weirder and more stressful than anything I had experienced before. I just hoped this would be the end of things. Since it was Friday night, I stayed up really late. I was still anxious to sleep. By 1 a.m., my parents had gone to bed and nothing had happened yet. I was beginning to feel like things had worked. I checked my phone. There were no notifications from Chris. I decided to call him, just to check up on him. All I got was his voicemail. He's just asleep, I thought. I continued to play video games until I heard shouting outside my window. I recognized Chris' voice. I immediately ran to my window and opened it. There he was, standing in the moonlit backyard, still in pajamas and shaking. "Dude, what are you doing here? Did something happen?" I yelled. We have to go to the circle. Now. Things have gotten worse." Chris huffed. "What are you talking about? What happened?" Ugh. Chris sighed angrily and started walking towards the forest without a flashlight. Fuck. I said to myself as I put on a pair of pants and grabbed a flashlight. I also grabbed a knife, just in case. I went downstairs, careful not to wake my parents, and went to the back door. Chris was gone. I was scared, but I wasn't about to let my best friend go to the circle alone. It occurred to me that this might be a trick, an inhuman force appearing as Chris. This was a common twist in horror stories. Even so, I wasn't going to risk leaving Chris alone in the woods without a flashlight. I opened the door, took a deep breath, and started towards the tree lane. There was a stagnant mist hanging in the forest as I followed the marked trees, calling out Chris's name. I gripped the knife tight in my left hand as I carefully made my way through the woods. Eventually, I came to the circle and it was wider than before. It even seemed to be growing before my eyes. There was a loud groan as a tree at the edge lost its grip on the earth and tumbled in, disappearing silently into the abyss. "Heather," I heard Chris say behind me. "Chris," I shouted as I turned around. He was standing with a slouch just a couple feet away from me. "What happened, man? Why are we here?" "I don't know. I don't know, but it's worse now. It's worse, Heather." "Chris, calm down. Talk to me." "No," Chris shouted. He pushed me, and I fell down. I looked behind me. The hole was coming closer. It was hungry. "Chris, what the fuck?" I shouted as I stood up. He grunted and lunged at me. I dodged him, and he stumbled, nearly falling into the expanding abyss. "I have to, Heather. It's the only way." He lunged at me again and successfully knocked me against a tree, my head colliding with the bark. I dropped everything in my hands as I hit the tree. He shoved me harder against the bark as I tried to punch and push him away, but he wasn't budging. "I'm sorry, Chris," I shouted as I brought my left leg up between his knees. He instantly keeled over as I grabbed the knife from beside the tree. "Please calm down and tell me what happened," I said, panting. "I don't want to have to defend myself again." Chris moaned in pain and looked up at me before trying to lunge at me again. I sidestepped him and slashed clumsily with the knife. I think it tore his shirt, but everything was happening so fast. I quickly moved away so that I wasn't facing the growing hole behind me and held up the knife. "Chris, please, stop this," Chris cried out and came at me again. I swung the knife frantically as he approached me, landing one swipe on his torso. He put his hand to his chest, feeling the warm blood seep between his fingers. He looked at me with a look of anger I had never seen before. I was afraid before this, but now I truly feared for my life. "Please, Chris, I'm not playing." I tried to step back, but he lunged at me again. I raised the knife and stabbed at him, aiming for somewhere that wouldn't kill him. He grunted as the blade of my knife sank into his right shoulder. He took a step backward and looked me in my eyes. "Heather." He stumbled back once more and caught his foot on a stone by the edge of the circle. "Chris, no." I sprang forward and tried to grab at him as he fell backwards, but I was too late. I watched in terror as he disappeared into the abyss, screaming as he fell. The ground quaked as the hole stopped growing. I collapsed to the ground and cried there for several minutes, the fear replaced with anguish. "Chris, no." I choked. I had killed my best friend. Even though it was in self-defense, I could not help but blame myself for what had happened. I wanted to wake up, but this wasn't a dream. It was a living nightmare. Too distraught to comprehend what had just occurred, I grabbed my flashlight and stumbled back home through the mist. I woke my parents up as soon as I got home and told them everything. They were skeptical, but my dad agreed to follow me out to the woods after seeing how shaken I really was. The mist was gone, and I led him along the marked trees until we reached the end. He sighed. "Heather, there's nothing here. It was just a dream." My dad sighed. I stared in absolute disbelief at the solid ground before me. This was where the circle had been. I could see the rock that Chris had tripped on, the disturbed soil where a tree had fallen into nothingness. I propped myself against a tree, overcome with nausea. "Honey, are you okay?" My dad asked, putting a hand on my shoulder. It must have been a dream after all, I said. I didn't believe it. Everything I had just experienced seemed so real. The circle, the knife, the blood, Chris' screams, all seared into my brain. But I didn't want to try to rationalize it right then. We returned home, and I went to bed, although I never went to sleep. I kept trying to call Chris throughout the night and the following days, but he never answered. Neither would his parents when I called his house. I knocked on their door, but no one seemed to be home. The following Monday, Chris didn't show up to school. Same with Tuesday and Wednesday. The police searched his house and found both of his parents dead in some sort of bloodbath. The cops theorized that Chris had murdered his parents and ran away to avoid arrest. But I knew the truth. Chris was dead. I was the only one who knew what had really happened to him. But what could I say? People would just think I was crazy, or that I was trying to cover for my friend. The circle was gone. So was my best friend. But the memories would never fade, nor the constant struggle to come to terms with what had happened and why. You can be assured of one thing, though. I haven't spent a day in the woods since. Fifth story. Camping in the Ozarks. I love camping. I always have. Back where I grew up in Lousaville, Kentucky, you'd have to make a decent drive to find a good, secluded place to camp. That's the key to a successful trip, you know. You have to find a spot that's off on its own, away from the visitor's center and all the first-time campers that tend to litter the site with cans and wrappers. I'm also an avid horror buff, and as such, I'm aware that secluded camping usually leads to slasher massacres or witch hauntings or goat men attacks. At least in the stories and movies. Of course, they're just that, right? Stories and movies. But then, every one of those tales also stars a skeptic. I left Kentucky at the end of high school to attend college in Arkansas. You see, my mother had gone to school there, and they provided generous scholarship of in-state tuition to children of graduates, even if they come from a couple of states away. Going to school in the Ozarks as a camping addict is fantastic. You wouldn't believe all the amazing spots there are to pitch a tent and enjoy nature at its purest. The Ozark National Forest, Devil's Den, Washita Park, and just dozens more. America's most obese state is an ironic haven for hikers and campers alike. Jared was kind of like our leader. He was the guy that always knew a spot, no matter where we were camping. He had this map, completely tattooed in markings and directions to all the most breathtaking areas. When we went to a new spot, or at least a spot that was new to him, he would mark it on the map in either green, if the spot was good, or red, if the spot was shitty. There were marks in other colors as well, different ones, but they are few and far between. He also marks the directions to each spot in highlighter. Jared looked the part too. A long-haired granola-style hippie with a sleeve of tats and a couple of earrings in each ear. But our walking stereotype was the best of the best when it came to camping, and his information was rarely secondhand. So when he burnt up the group message running his mouth about a new spot his cousin found a couple hours south, we all cleared our schedules. I mean, how often were we all new to a location? We all met up at our buddy Kyle's house to pack the truck with supplies. Kyle's dad was pretty wealthy, and as a gift for raising his GPA to a 3.0, his father had bought him a brand new F-150 to hopefully keep his academic train rolling. My roommate and I showed up first, along with a cooler full of beer as a peace offering to Kyle for driving. We weren't technically legal, but Allie was only a month or two away, and she had a pretty killer fake, so we rationalized it morally, just as we had been doing for years. Austin was next, with his 5-6 person tent and a Sam's Club bulk of beef jerky, and Jared arrived last. Just so you know, we abide by general road trip rules in this truck. Kyle barked, sliding into the front seat and bringing the engine to life. So I don't want to hear a single complaint about my music choice. I snorted. New truck, new rules. I vote we make some amendments. Seriously, I'm not listening to fucking Trap the whole ride. Austin laughed. You morons have no appreciation for my tastes. Eventually, we decided on a rotation, and pulled out of his driveway to head to Jared's cousin's spot, a place called Creekbend. Apparently, it wasn't well known enough to be on the entire damn internet, so we navigated there pre-2003 style, the old-fashioned way. The trip went quick, and after 3 hours of listening to Kyle's trap and an assorted mix of alternative, we pulled off the main road and onto a dirt trail somewhere in southern Arkansas. We drove for another half hour or so before the trail abruptly ended. "Oh, this is it all right." Jared chuckled with a smile. "Let's grab the shit and get set up. I don't want to be fumbling with the tent in the dark." We followed Jared through the brush for a bit until we reached a gorgeous clearing. The mountains rose up all around us, and the mid-autumn trees set the world ablaze. The setup didn't take long, and soon we had the tent in perfect shape and a roaring fire. We had been shooting the shit for an hour or so, enjoying the sunset and roasting hot dogs, when Allie asked the question we had all been wondering. "How'd your cousin even find this place?" Allie asked, sipping her beer. Jared shrugged. "He didn't, really. Max frequents this outdoors Y forum, and he said this guy PM'd him the site with pictures. He wanted to check it out first, but he was busy all weekend and knew we would be all for breaking it in. He took a drink of his own beer. So here we are. I think it's a pretty good spot. Sounds like the plot to a horror flick." Allie laughed. "Random stranger gives coordinates to mystery camping location." Austin grinned. "Oh, I dare some psychopath to come take us on. I'd love to see one try with 6 holes in his skull." Jared rolled his eyes. "The guy was well known on the site. I thinks we're good. But nice to know you brought your gun." Austin laughed and reclined, flopping back to gaze at the stars. We decided to turn in a bit later, and while we all got ready for bed in the tent, Austin went to take a leak. When he came back, Allie held the zipper shut. "Password." She chimed. "Oh my God, are you in middle school? Just let me in." Austin groaned. "Sorry, rules are rules." "Okay. Is the password, 'You're all fucking idiots. Let me in, I'm freezing to death'?" He laughed. Allie giggled, and I threw a look at Jared and Kyle. We all thought they had a thing. "No, that's not it. Try again." We heard Austin shuffle his feet. "This is so stupid." He sighed. "Please. Come on in," Allie said with a 6th-grade smirk. We all slept together when we camped in the fall or winter since it was usually pretty cold. Plus, it was easier to bring one tent rather than 5. It wasn't ever weird or uncomfortable, and Kyle usually generated so much heat it would be worth it even if it were. You know that feeling when you wake up and you're not sure why? Like you can't quite place why you woke up? It's as if you were asleep and then suddenly you just weren't? That's how it was for me, only accompanied with a sense of anxiety. I tossed in my sleeping bag for a moment before I noticed Austin crouched by the exit of the tent, holding the zipper shut. I screwed my vision against the darkness. "Austin." "Sure," he hissed. I crawled over by him, and he looked at me, eyebrows raised. "I think something is outside the tent. Maybe like a bear or something. It woke me up." "Should we wake the others?" I asked. "Nah, He hesitated. "I'm not worried." "Did the sound wake you up too?" I shook my head. "Oh, well, it brushed up against the tent by my face, and that's what woke me. Thought maybe it had jarred you awake too. It sounded pretty big like Dash." He was interrupted by shuffling outside the tent. It did sound big. We looked at each other, and I kicked the others awake. "What the fuck, guys?" Kyle groaned. Jared shushed him, and we all listened again. We're shuffling. Closer to the tent this time. Austin had his hand on his bag, ready to grab the gun if it was a bear, which seemed pretty unlikely for Arkansas. We had been camping for years, and we had never seen a bear. Austin squinted through the mesh. "Guys," he whispered, "I don't think it's a bear." As if in response, whatever was outside moved directly in front of the zipper. Its voice was choppy, garbled, and sounded just like Austin. "Please," it stuttered. "Please. Please. 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 Let me in. Holy shit. Jared whimpered. Austin, even in the dark, paled. We're shuffling. I'm freezing. Please. Please let me in. Let me in. Let me in. It rasped in Austin's voice. Who's out there? Austin barked, his own voice carrying all the fear he tried to hide. Who's out there? The thing replied. Who's in there? It mimicked Austin's tones for each word, making the sentences improperly mesh together. I said who is out there, I have a gun. Austin's voice betrayed his terror even more this time. Kyle and I looked at each other, and Allie started to shake. We knew this wasn't a person. I had read all the stories, watched the movies. This wasn't human, whatever it was. Gun, gun, gun. It was like it was trying the word out, like a fucked up, learning by phonics lesson. Let me in. I am freezing to death. Please, please, please. It moaned. The voice sounded more together this time, as it got the hang of Austin's voice. Kyle crawled forward and slammed both his hands on the mesh. No. Go away. He shouted, rapid shuffling in place. No, 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 no. It screamed in a butchered version of Kyle. No, please, Aletman. I'm freezing. Then, in the combined voice of dozens of people, I'm starving. Austin choked back a sob and ripped his gun from his pack. No. Jared hissed. Austin, stop, you don't dash. He fired it through the mesh, emptying the chamber. An otherworldly shriek pierced the stagnant air as the shuffling retreated. To the car. Now. Jared hissed. You shouldn't have done that, Austin, he added, unzipping and ducking out the flap. We all followed, blinding, stumbling after Jared, leaving all the stuff behind with whatever the hell was back there. I could hear it giving chase. It broke through the trail somewhere far behind us, awkward gait crashing through the trees and bush. We reached the car, clambering in, most of us crying. I turned in my seat as Kyle revved the engine to life, searching the tree lane. Its body was illuminated by the moon as it emerged from the brush. It must have been 9 feet tall, skin white as the light that revealed it. Its form was like a distorted human's, an unsettlingly long, thick torso with bony, unnaturally thin limbs protruding it. The legs were short, and I wondered just how it managed to stay standing on such weak-looking extremities. Its arms were equally thin, but long enough to drag along the ground as it walked. It had human-like hands, for elongated fingers, and a claw-like thumbnail in place of the digit. Its head was a darkness all its own. It was disproportionate for one. Its mouth took up almost the entire face, and was filled with teeth of various shapes and sizes. It had no nose, but its eyes glinted, all pupil, in the bright light of the moon. Just under its chin was a large sac, like a tumor or blister. It hung nearly to its shoulders and pulsed with every shriek and moan it gave. Kyle floored the pedal, and we peeled down the trail. It watched as we flew down the road, completely still, and gave one final scream as we disappeared from sight. We were silent the entire ride home. The only sound was Jared shaking hands as he pulled out the map and drew a purple X through Creekbend. I still camp sometimes, but only at the visitors' areas. The 5 of us haven't been out together since. I wonder about Jared's map sometimes. There were other markings on it, more than just red, green, and Creekbend's purple. Sometimes I wonder what else he's seen. He's a pretty avid camper.